Well, happy Friday afternoon, everyone. It has been wonderful to be with you for the last 2 days as part of our first Local Journalism Summit. Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Melody Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia, and in partnership with our fantastic partners, Virginia Humanities and Foothills Forum, as well as the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It has been wonderful to host you, and the vibrancy of this gathering has been really heartening to me. And I think I speak for all of my partners. I'm looking at Matthew, hopefully he won't run up and grab me and snatch me away. But when I say that this isn't a one and done, this is the beginning of additional work that we plan to do and do in collaboration with you and with others who have been here for the last 2 days. I also want to thank the members of the advisory committee who conceived of this convening, and to thank them. I don't know if we have any advisory committee members who are still here this afternoon, but deep appreciation for all of the work that they put into this. So typically by the time you get to the last session of a 2-day convening, everyone is kind of limping along. That is not what we have for you this afternoon. I can promise you that you are in for a real treat as we have a conversation between Jamie Swain and Evan Smith. And for people who need no introduction, I'm still going to provide an introduction just because I am so delighted to have spent time with both of them and to have become friends with both of them, and really proud of the work that they've done. Evan Smith, and you've been hearing his name dropped for the last few days, for those of you who don't know him, is a real pioneer when it comes to local journalism. He is the founder and was the editor of the Texas Tribune, based in Austin, Texas, and has done groundbreaking work. People often refer to his work. You heard that earlier through the day, and the transformation of the media landscape in Texas because of what he's done. In addition to TribFest, which I think, Evan, something like 9,000 or 10,000 people go to TribFest annually. The Texas Tribune has been a real model for independent, unbiased media, and has used that platform to provide information to the people of Texas, over 30 million people, in a way that people are looking to model and referring to today, and I think will be doing so for generations to come. Evan retired as CEO of the Texas Tribune at the end of 2022, and he currently serves as a senior advisor there, as well as a senior advisor to the Emerson Collective. My guess is he'll talk some about that work this afternoon, but still a deep commitment to local journalism. Yep. However, with all of that, I will tell you that for me, the most important thing that Evan has done is that he is our inaugural Distinguished Fellow in Journalism at the Karsh Institute of Democracy. And I will take a moment of privilege to tell you that Evan is very, very generous with his time, his expertise, his digital Rolodex, and we are deeply appreciative of that. Now, Evan will be in conversation with Jamie Swain, who is, I think, for people who live in Richmond or Virginia, again, someone who needs no introduction because of the work that she's done. A deep background in journalism and in media, and has worked on the national level for many years, but now serves as the leader of VPM, having changed the name from Virginia Public Media to VPM, and oversees a network that provides information to over 2 million people in Central Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. VPM has, under her leadership, strengthened its work as a source of information for Virginians, has produced award-winning content that is both seen nationally and internationally. And again, I will tell you, with all of that, one of the most important things from my perspective is that Jamie is one of the newest board members for the Karsh Institute, and I want to thank you for that as well, Jamie. So with that, I want to turn this over to Jamie and to Evan, and to let you all engage in a conversation with each other and with the audience. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Melody.
Thanks, Melody.
Well, thank you all. You've made it to the end. Many people in this room have been here for 2 days, and I see some new faces, which is wonderful. Evan, it is just an honor to have you here in Richmond. You wore an orange tie. I'm assuming for UVA, and I know you might have a different.
Sure.
Go with it, Evan. I also understand
Sure.
yesterday was your birthday, so we are very happy to have you.
It was. Look, I want to tell you, first of all, how much I appreciate being able to sit across from you, my sister in arms. We were together in the PBS system when Jamie was a top executive at the system, and we all knew that Jamie was the one, and that one day she would run one of these and maybe run all of these. And Jamie has definitely done a wonderful job in this role, and of course I feel honored to be associated with Melody and with the Karsh Institute. It's great to be here.
Good. Well, now no pressure, but this
Okay,
is the
go.
grand finale.
Yeah, we're the ones that are the last thing standing between them and the bar.
That is exactly correct. It's Friday, and it's
It is
beautiful
Friday.
outside.
That's exactly right.
And I will say, I think this crowd is an extremely sophisticated crowd.
Good.
So you have journalists, you have editors, you have people who are starting
Yeah.
digital, news organizations. You have funders.
Yeah.
They have all come to hear you and why your model is super successful. So first,
Right.
tell us a little bit about why were you compelled to start the Texas Tribune?
I'm happy to tell the story. I mean, no pressure. Why your model is super successful. I'm used to always thinking that we aren't successful and that we want to be successful, even if the facts would suggest otherwise. Like in politics, I took the last 13 years, I took the position that we were running like we were losing. I think part of it is that if you run one of these, you never say, I'm successful, or think that you're successful. You think maybe that you're succeeding. Mm-hmm. But you haven't succeeded because around the corner there are always threats to be addressed. The work is never done. Look, the state of Texas is interesting. Right.
Well, really.
Next, I'm going to tell you that
Breaking news.
water is wet. It is the center of the news universe at all times, usually good and bad simultaneously. And in a state like Texas, where you have, as you heard Melody say, 30 million or more people, 5 of the 12 largest cities by population in the country, more than any other state. We have the most big cities of any state. Terrible news deserts around our state. I was the editor-in-chief and ultimately president of Texas Monthly, which is a big magazine, national magazine of Texas, published out of Austin, but statewide, really national in focus. And so I had a pretty good perspective on what the landscape was heading out of the door there and into the door at the Tribune in 2009. And we were trying to solve not one problem, but 2. The first was not enough coverage of public policy and politics in a state as important and as influential and as iconic and often as infuriating as the state of Texas is. You cannot have thoughtful and productive citizens if those citizens don't know what's going on in their community and if they don't know how government is making decisions that affects them and their lives and the lives of the people around them. What government is doing for them and to them is how I would think about it. In the state of Texas, we had some pretty iconic news organizations over the years, including the Dallas Morning News and the Houston Chronicle, but I'm old enough to remember when Houston and Dallas, and not only those 2 cities, had 2 newspapers. Mm-hmm. During my time in Texas, the Houston Post folded, the Dallas Times-Herald folded, the San Antonio Light folded, the afternoon newspaper in El Paso folded, and the number of reporters from 1991 when I moved to Texas to 2009 when we started the Tribune, the number of reporters at the state capitol dwindled to 1/3 of what it had been. And so I and the people who started the Tribune were mostly concerned that in a state like Texas, if you were affected by decisions made on public and higher education, immigration, transportation, criminal justice, the environment, you had no place to go to find out what was going on. So we wanted to start a reliable, credible, independent source of news, without regard to party, partisanship, or ideology, wearing the team of no party, no ideology. The only team we were for was Team Texas. Love the state, but love it enough to be honest about the challenges. Talk about what's working, but talk about what needs to work better. That was the way we thought about the Tribune, and why we started it was to be that resource, that source and that resource for the people who lived in the state. But the second reason that we started the Tribune, Jamie, and the problem we were trying to solve was there is no reliable for-profit model to support this kind of work. We have a tendency in this country, I think, to romanticize things completely out of proportion with reality. I describe this as a restoration hardware problem. We're nostalgic for a time that never actually existed, right?
Right.
And I think that in journalism, we are all nostalgic for a time when the dials turned and the money came in and we could afford to do the kind of work that we think we need to do in a country like ours, but I'm not even sure it was ever as good as we remember it. It's certainly terrible now. It was in '09. We thought it was bad then. We started the Tribune because we thought it would get worse. We had no idea how right we were.
All right, let's get practical for this
Yeah.
group. All right, how many people did you start with, and where was the seed money, and how did you get it?
We had less than $4 million, just a hair less than $4 million in the bank on the first day, which was November the 3rd of 2009. Election Day 2009, symbolism matters. We chose that day deliberately. We had 17 full-time on our staff, 11 of those in the newsroom. And we had a choice to make, Jamie, as all people starting one of these, all people have choices to make at that moment. Where do you invest the money that you have, whether it's less than $4 million or it's significantly more than that in the cases of some startups more recently, Houston, Baltimore, which have 20 and 50 million available to them at startup. Or in the case of most of these startups, they probably have $1 million or $1.5 million. How do you spend those dollars for the greatest effect? The calculation from our purposes was, for our purposes was, we can either have a perfectly functioning business side and nothing to sell, or we can have amazing journalism that over-delivers on the promise that we're going to serve the state and serve the communities in our state, and then we'll backfill the selling function. And so we chose the latter. We said we're going to flood the zone on journalism because you never get a second chance to make a first impression. If you limp out of the gate, nobody thinks you're serious about it. We wanted to wow people with the ambition of the work that we did and our commitment to a public service mission. And so we had 11 in the newsroom, we had 6 on the business side. You know, I would have preferred, honestly, if we had had a couple more on the business side. But, you know, eventually you make peace with the fact that that's the call you made. And
Well, I want to pull that thread. So
Yeah.
here you are, a journalist.
Yeah.
You go and you start this, and now you find yourself running a business. How
Right.
do you make that? Because I've heard a lot of people,
Yeah.
you know, you're talking about small startups who some people are playing editor and fundraiser.
every
and,
role that you could possibly, I have told the people I advise now in my post-CEO life as a consultant that you can do everything poorly or a couple things well. And if you're the person starting one of these and you are the CEO and you're the COO and you're the CFO and you're the HR person and you're cleaning the cups in the kitchen, you will do none of those jobs successfully.
Yeah.
At some point, maybe not on the first day, but at some point you've got to figure out a way to bring in enough money to hire at least 2 key roles. One is somebody to be responsible for bringing in the money, development, revenue. Second job that's critical at the beginning is someone who can lead a strategy that gets you to an audience that is significant enough to be measured, to demonstrate that you have impact. Without money coming in and people getting the content that you're producing for one of these, it's a Pyrrhic victory. Now, there are other jobs you'd like to have eventually if you raise enough money, but on that first day, you're correct. A lot of us play all those roles and more, and it's tough.
Well, how'd you teach yourself this whole business
Yeah,
side?
you have to be self-taught, I'm afraid, at least in the early going. Look, I was the editor-in-chief of a big magazine. I didn't actually have any idea how to do this job. And so for people in the room who are either doing it or are thinking about doing it, it's not an unusual circumstance to find yourself in over your head. You don't want to be there too long. But it's rare for somebody to show up on the first day totally able to do one of these. And look, and Jamie, the thing is, I can't say to you, this is, I mean, I'd love to be able to come up with leadership of one of these in a box and then put it on the shelf and then you go buy it. There is no one way to do this.
Right.
Every one of these is different. If you've seen one nonprofit news organization, you've seen one nonprofit news organization. Every one of these is different. Every community is different. The needs of every community, the issues that are important are different. The approach to reaching the people in that community is different and every leader is different.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think a lot of people take your model
Yeah.
and they see you and they herald, oh, the Texas Tribune, and then they go and plug it in and it doesn't work and they're like, why did this happen?
Well,
Well, number one, they don't have Evan Smith. I mean,
well,
but you also-
thank you, but I don't actually agree with that. But
one thing Melody forgot to talk about is your show on PBS, right? You are
Yeah.
known as an interviewer. You
Yeah.
do have, I think, those connections, and I think, I'm sure that helped you, right, raise the money and the visibility of what you were trying to do, which doesn't exist everywhere.
Sure.
So,
Well,
yeah.
one of the conundrums that I think people have when they start one of these is, I don't know where to go to raise money. Leave aside the question of, if I know where to go, how do I do it and how do I do it successfully? They don't even know where to begin. I had the benefit of running a big magazine for 18 years that everybody in the state of Texas knew, and therefore I knew all the people who were significant, most of them in any case in the state of Texas, so I could go to Boone Pickens before we launched a Tribune and I could say, you should give me your money because you have it.
That's very
I
compelling.
know you have it, and here's what we're going to do. And you know that you may not like everything that we do, just like you didn't like everything we did in Texas Monthly, but you know we're going to be fair, thorough, and accurate. This is back when there were norms, right? Now that we don't even agree on what facts are, but we'll talk about that. Or I could go to Red McCombs, who was the owner, I think, then or not long after that, of the Minnesota Vikings, who was a big car dealership, owned a bunch of car dealerships in San Antonio. Both Boone Pickens and Red McCombs at the time were among the wealthiest Americans, and of course among the wealthiest Texans. And I could say to them, I'm starting this thing, here's what we're starting, here's what we intend to do, here's why we think this is good for Texas, and you should put money in. Knowing who those people are is job number one, and then figuring out a strategy to get them to part with their money to support this thing is not an insignificant job,
Right.
but it's job number two.
Yep.
I think for a lot of people on the first day, they don't even know where to go, and they don't know how to ask.
Yep.
You have to do that over and over before you become comfortable with it. And look, we said at the beginning that we're going to make a lot of mistakes on the way to succeeding, assuming we even succeed. We had no assumptions that we were going to be successful. I think the thing that kills most people in a startup like the Tribune, even all these years later, is risk aversion. People are so afraid of failure that they don't try anything that they don't know will succeed, because the cost of failure is so high. And I think you've got to take the position out of the gate that you're going to try a bunch of things, whether they've worked elsewhere and been tried before or not. You got to try everything. And if it doesn't work, you got to brush yourself off, learn from it, and move on. That cliche about learning more from failure than success turns out to be true. And we made every mistake at the beginning that you could make, including asking some people who were never going to give us money, not for a moment, spending a lot of time, investing a lot of our energy and time trying to get them to give us money. You got to go, well, I'd rather take yes for an answer, but I'm prepared to take no. You tried.
You just keep trying.
Got to just keep trying.
So fast forward, so you started with $4 million. Obviously, when you left, you can tell us a little bit about your revenue, but I'd love to know the diversification of your
Sure.
revenue streams and what that looked like, and that'll pull us to
Right.
Trip
So just to
Festival.
roll
Yeah.
forward from
Yeah.
the beginning to the last day as CEO at the end of last year, December 31st, we raised $120 million to pay for serious journalism in a state where the people in elective office think that we're fake news. And the money came from a mix of revenue sources, including a number of extremely wealthy people, many of whom are political donors. And the interesting thing there is the most Republicans alongside the most Democrats supported the Tribune. Greg Abbott's largest donors and Beto O'Rourke's largest donors. A magic trick worthy of Houdini. That we were able to pull that off. In hyper-polarized Texas today, the idea that we were able to get significant Republican money and significant Democratic money, people who'd been playing in politics, I consider to be maybe the most important thing that we did. Our mix of revenue over those, and by the way, the staff of the Tribune is now about 100, including 50 journalists at the state capitol in Austin, which makes the Tribune the largest newsroom covering a state capitol in any state of any news organization, for-profit or nonprofit, in the entire country. We're probably half the press corps at the Capitol, just our reporters. And you know, the other news organizations in the state have cut their number of reporters. It's not down to zero, but we overwhelm everybody else combined because we've just said this is all we do. We don't spend money on printing because we don't print a print edition. We don't spend money on paper because we don't print a print edition. We don't have to distribute our print product. Our money goes to people. Money comes in the door to pay for journalism, and that journalism is in the form of people. And so the vast majority of the money that comes in every year, and this year the Tribune's revenue budget is about $13.5 million. The lion's share of that is just paying for people. So 120 million, about 100 people on staff right now, and the mix of revenue is roughly 5 equal buckets. About 20% is wealthy individuals, high net worth individuals, and family offices. And we consider a major gift to be $5,000 or more. And we'll do this year somewhere in the vicinity of 2.7 or 2.8 million in major individual gifts. About 20% is institutional philanthropy. So at the national level, foundations like Gates, Ford, Knight, Emerson Collective, my employer, which has been a big supporter of the Tribunes over the years. That's how I got to know them, and we can talk about that. And then all the big foundations in Texas, Houston Endowment in Houston, and Meadows Foundation in Dallas, and the like. About 20% is small dollar gifts, membership gifts, regular folks who just believe in the value of our work, much, Jamie, as you put out through the public broadcasting door a product that people can consume for free, but you hope they value it enough to write you a small check every year. We do the same, and we do about 20% of our revenue in membership gifts. About 20% of it is corporate support. You think of corporate support, and I think of corporate support as sponsorship.
Yeah, I was going to say define your corporate
Let's
support.
be honest, it's the artist formerly known as advertising. If you squint at it, you wouldn't know the difference between advertising and sponsorship. I've asked the IRS repeatedly over the years, tell me the difference. They can't tell me the difference. And so I've given up trying. We just go ahead because we're guilty and we're Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. We pay 10% of that corporate support. We say it's taxable, and we pay sales tax on it just because we made a number up, just to be hygienic. Because I don't know what the difference between sponsorship and advertising is, and as I said, they can't tell me either. But we said some of this is probably advertising, so we're just going to call it that. And then 20% of our revenue comes through our editorial events. And we do editorial events. We do live journalism. We do events as journalism, not barbecue festivals and bridal shows and the stuff that comes out of the marketing departments of newspaper. We don't, I mean, that's respect. If you can, that's part of what you do, great. We do journalism in real time. We do accountability in real time. We do elected officials on a stage like this one, in front of an audience like this one, on the record, cameras rolling. We ask them hard questions. We make news, we break news with those kinds of events.
So that's TribFest, right?
Well, it's the big festival that we do every year in September, the Texas Tribune Festival, TribFest. But before the pandemic, we were doing, on average, 50 events a year.
Wow.
About one a week all over the state of Texas. And it might be the governor, it might be the mayor of Amarillo, it might be the state representative and the state senator who represent Texarkana, and we bring them back home in front of their constituents. Often it's the first time their constituents have had the chance to be in the same room with them because we don't have competitive elections in Texas. And so nobody has to go home and ask to be rehired.
Well, I'm impressed they even show up. We can't even get people to debate anymore.
You know what? If you go to Texarkana and you say to Travis Clardy, the state representative, and Robert Nichols, the state senator, we're going to come to the community college in your neck of the woods, in your district, and we're going to have your constituents out there. We're asking you to come out. If you don't come, we're going to tell them that we asked you to come in front of your constituents and that you said no. Like, let's be honest.
Yeah.
2009, the proposition of getting people to come out, and 2023, it's different. Things have changed. But basically, we ask people to come out and they say yes. And look, it's great. I mean, for the people in Texarkana who have concerns about public education funding, the failure of Texas to expand Medicaid despite having 5.2 million people without health insurance, more than any other state, transportation funding, I mean, mundane stuff, you know. They don't have an opportunity to ask questions on those issues or have anybody else ask questions on those issues of the people who represent them at the Capitol.
Yep. And
so we do on their behalf. And we do hour-long events, 40 minutes of conversation like this, and then we open up the floor for questions. And I can promise you, the minute that microphone is in the center aisle, their constituents are lined up, you know, to the state line. And we end up always having questions that don't get time to be asked because people are desperate to be in a conversation with people whose decisions affect them. And this, to me, is the hack. State legislatures are making decisions in all 50 states that affect you and people like you every single day. Only there is hardly any transparency into the work of state legislatures. And my big concern is, I think, again, the state of Texas, in 2021, our legislature meets 5 months every 2 years, odd-numbered years. So they're meeting right now. So go back to the 21 session. We passed a 6-week abortion ban that was not the catalyst for the overturning of Roe, but it definitely was a big factor in the conversation nationally about reproductive health and the rights of women to make those decisions. Permitless carry of handguns, no license, no training, proposed and passed by people who said on the floor of our legislature, the Constitution is my license. I don't need to have a license. I don't need to be trained. An overhaul of election laws predicated on non-existent voter fraud. Voter fraud that was not provable because it didn't happen, and yet it was the pretext for an overhaul of election law that indisputably made it harder for people, and specifically in certain communities, to access the vote. That's just 3 issues that happened in our legislature. Our legislators had their hands on these issues, but for the work of journalism, people in the state of Texas would not have had any idea that these things had happened. In every state, there's a version of that story, and that's why this work is so critical, and events are a big part of literally going to people with this work. We said at the beginning, like a technology company, the strategy had to be push, not pull. You're not bringing them to you, you are going to them. And going to them means literally going into a community and saying, we're bringing our journalism, we're bringing accountability to you in the room.
So on that note, obviously you've been close to public broadcasting. You served on the board of Texas or Austin PBS. There are models here. We talked the other day about government funding state.
Right.
One of the mix I did not hear is either state or federal funding. Was that avoided like the plague? Yeah,
hard pass on that. I love people who are trying to figure out how to fund journalism, and my friend Steve Waldman, who you know, who runs the Rebuild Local News Coalition, he's a great friend of mine. I am just not for the idea of government playing a role here. Getting a 501c3 designation from the IRS is one thing. That is not government support. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is money that would come to news organizations in the form of payroll tax credits or some other kind of rebate per employee, or maybe we're going to offer a second tax exemption for a small business that chooses to advertise in a local news organization. The intentions are good, but at the end of the day, I don't like any of the plans I've heard really at all. They concern me in terms of the independence of our journalism and the perception and the reality of that independence, perception in many respects being more problematic than the reality of it. Yeah. I mean, in the case of some of the bills that have been floated, they would allow for-profit news organizations to benefit alongside nonprofit news organizations from this government support. Now, if there are any people who run for-profit news organizations in the room, thank you for your service. New paragraph. I don't believe that for-profit news organizations, many of those are the ones who created the problem to begin with by hollowing out. Why should the Alden Capitals of the world and the hedge funds, why should the arsonists be rewarded for setting the fire? I don't want to see the for-profit guys benefit from this. Steve Waldman says to me, well, but so many of the black newspapers and the Hispanic radio and television stations in communities of color that desperately need this work are for-profit. Great, cap the revenues on the news organizations that would be available to receive this funding, or cap the number of employees so that the arsonists are not getting support. Like, to me, there's a way to re-engineer this so that maybe I could get on the side of it, but you will remember that when I was on a national PBS board in the first President Trump budget, presidential budgets are dead on arrival, they mean nothing, but the first budget defunded the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And I was alone among the PBS board members.
You were
who
not
said,
popular, no.
I was like, great. People said, what? And I said, I just don't want government funding media. We need to be independent. I mean, this is how long ago it was. Eli Broad was alive. I was like, Eli Broad will write us a check. We'll just get wealthy people around the country will replace the money that CPB was providing to these stations. We don't need to do this. I still believe that. I may lose this battle.
I was going to
but
say
I'm
a
gonna go down
controversial,
swinging.
right?
I'm going to go down
sitting
swinging if I
on
can.
this side.
Yeah, I understand.
Well, and interestingly, before we got up on stage, Elon Musk actually finally took down the government-funded label on PBS and NPR because
Yeah.
it was the insinuation. So finally,
that guy.
That guy.
There's, by the way, as you will, there's
we could
always,
spend a whole hour on
there's
that.
always a Texas connection in every story. Elon
And
Musk.
didn't you say?
Elon Musk lives in Austin. That's
Yeah.
that's
You have
our
interesting
it's
neighbors.
Our cross to bear.
You know, one of the things that
It's
came
a
up.
cross in the shape of that Tesla T. Yeah.
One of the things that has come up often,
Yeah.
you know, when you talk about nonprofit and fundraising,
Yes.
it's around impact and metrics.
Right.
What were your metrics of success?
Well, I'll tell you what they were not first. I'm going to tell you what they are, but I'm first going to tell you what they're not. We are not in the business in public service journalism of electing or defeating candidates or passing or defeating legislation. I think a lot of people go out of the gate assuming that their job is to somehow put pelts on the wall. That is not our job. Sometimes because of the work we do, when we do it properly, pelts materialize. That's fine. But we're not in the making horses drink business. We're merely in the leading them to water business, right? We tee up for people in their busy lives the things important enough for them to stop and pay attention to. We surface challenges and opportunities, problems, solutions, and all that for the people who engage with our content. But we are not in the advocacy business. There is a bright line, as far as I'm concerned, between advocacy and accountability. This is the point at which somebody in an audience rushes the stage and wants to debate me about objectivity.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I don't want to do that because I actually am sympathetic to the idea that this whole conversation around objectivity is one that is old enough that it is reasonable to say, objectivity for whom and defined by whom? Peace. I get that. I'm simply talking about whether the job of journalism is to persuade people to do something or not do something, or is the job of journalism, the kind that I do, that we do, to inform and educate and engage people so that they then can be successful advocates for themselves. Change in this country happens from the ground up, not the top down. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And what we in journalism have an obligation to do is inform and engage people to the point that they become the best civic versions of themselves. We create more thoughtful and productive citizens with our journalism. And we have to do it often in places where there are so many barriers to our being successful. Jamie, as you know, this is the point at which a person in my role trots out all the statistics. 70 million people in this country, 1/5 of the population, live in a community with no source of news or one that is about to fall over. And as a result, the people in that community have no access to the information that they need to do what I just described, to be the best civic versions of themselves, to advocate for themselves. It will come as no surprise to you that most of that 70 million are in counties that are either black or brown, in plurality or majority, and where the median household income, regardless of race, is below the national average. We've lost 1/4 of the nation's newspapers since 2005. By the time we get to the 20-year mark in 2 years, it'll be 1/3 of the nation's newspapers. We know that the news business has been hemorrhaging employees. The employment in the news business is down 26% since 2008. This stuff's tattooed on my forearm. I tell people this every place I go. This is the pernicious threat, right? And so we'd love to tell people these are the things that matter, but there are a lot of people in communities who have no way to learn that. We can't tell them because there is no source of news. Right. And even if you create a digital news organization like the Tribune, in Texas at least, 1 out of every 3 rural households in Texas has no access to broadband. Like the problems pile up along the way to trying to come up with a solution. So I want to stay out of the business of advocacy. I want to focus on accountability. I want to focus on informing people, handing the baton to them to take ownership of these problems and these challenges. There are a lot more obstacles in the road, as I said, than there were before, but I still think this is the right work and the most important work to be done. There are 2 Americas, one informed and one not. What are we going to do about that? That is the question I ask myself every single day. And the problem with having one America that is uninformed is that misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories take hold. The people in those communities become susceptible to misinformation and disinformation because they have nothing else to rely on. They get what's in their feed. Now I'm trying not to look at David Grant. The fact is that the problem of not having access to news is that you have access to something that is not news. That's the poison coursing through all of our veins. And the antidote is journalism in the public interest. Good information pushes out bad. And we have to be in the business of giving people good information. It seems pretty simple to me. I don't assume it's simple to everybody else.
Well, how do we then, so what, you're working with Emerson, you're working with Karsh.
I am.
You're out there looking at different models. I think, how do we give people a little bit of hope in this room? What are you seeing out there that
I think
works?
there's a ton of hope to be had. I'm watching through the work I'm doing with Emerson and outside of Emerson, news organizations pop up around the country like mushrooms after a rainstorm. People are getting it, and getting it to the point that they're motivated to come off the sidelines and either be the operators, the entrepreneurs, or to be the funders of this work. And you and I both know that not every one of these is going to work or should work.
Right.
There are a lot of people with good ideas, but they don't know how to read a budget or raise money, back to the point we had at the beginning. They know what to say on the first day, but the problem is there's a 10th day and a 100th day. And can they actually get to the point where they build this thing and have it be sustainable? But there's a lot of really amazing work happening around the country. I'm going to give you one example of any number that I could cite, and that's Mississippi Today. State House accountability journalism in the state of Mississippi. Based in Jackson, run by an extraordinary CEO, Mary Margaret White, and a great team of journalists who have done some of the most impactful accountability journalism over the last 12 months that I have seen for an organization of its size, punching absolutely above its weight. They may very well win a Pulitzer when the Pulitzers are announced for their reporting on a scandal involving welfare funds, misuse of welfare funds, by the former Governor Phil Bryant and by Brett Favre, the former NFL star. That series of stories is just an absolute marvel. I encourage you to read it. They also were extraordinary in their coverage of the Jackson water crisis, a problem that you could put any city's name in any number of states in that series of stories about the outdated infrastructure in these big cities. You cannot believe what year it is that we're still having the problem of whole communities without access to water. I mean, I live in the state, Texas, where the electric grid collapsed, so I certainly understand you can't believe that this stuff is happening today. But they are a nonprofit news organization. Their original benefactor was Andy Lack, who was the former president of NBC News, who grew up in Mississippi and came to Austin to study the Texas Tribune and said to me, if you think all the indicators of civic health in Texas are bad, Mississippi, my home state, says hold my beer. It's worse. He studied what we did for several days, talked to me and my people for a while, then went back to Mississippi, committed $1 million of his own money, as the story goes, found a number of other people from his childhood in Mississippi who themselves had made it as he had made it. They matched his gift, and he had about $5 million, I think, to start. And they have had a rockin' and rollin' accountability journalism organization in Mississippi, one of the very best in the entire country. And there are examples I could cite like that in other places. The Nevada Independent, Cal Matters in Sacramento, California. I mean, last week, there's a news organization called Mission Local. Covers the Mission District of San Francisco. You want to talk about local news? I'm talking about a neighborhood, okay? 3 journalists, budget of under $500,000. It was Mission Local that broke the story of the murder of this tech executive, this Cash App founder, Bob Lee, which everybody rushed in to say, well, San Francisco is a hell site. It must have been a homeless person who killed him. Turns out it was another tech person, a white tech consultant. It was Mission Local that broke the story. And the New York Times had to cite Mission Local's reporting when they reported the story subsequently. All over the country, there is meaningful work being done on that order, and that gives me enormous hope.
Well, that is hopeful. So let's talk about, one of the discussions we had too was around journalist pay. And retention.
Right.
I mean, and there are places, like you said, that have 2 or 3 journalists in a small town.
Right.
You know, they want to move on to the big paper or the big, next thing. How did you think about that? Because we've talked about the revenue side, but there's obviously the cost side. And how do you even get started or sustain? You start with the 3 journalists. You know, how do you move that forward?
First principles. Journalism is a profession. Journalists are professional. They should be paid a professional wage. This is not debatable. You do not pay less simply because you can get away with it. You have to pay competitively as a practical matter, otherwise you're not going to get people to come over from the dark side to the light side, right? But people deserve the dignity of a livable, competitive wage. So those of us who are founders have got to start, or run these things, have got to pay people what they deserve, period. No discussion. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is you are inevitably in the position of being the Durham Bulls. And when the people on your staff get called up to the show, like Nuke LaLoosh, they go. We lost people over the years to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and you bite through your lip to the point of bleeding. But you get through the night by telling yourself nobody poaches from a shitty news organization. Right?
I hope everyone wrote that down.
I had that conversation with myself many, many times. We are, in some respects, grooming the next generation of exceptional journalists, or this generation. But acknowledge that if somebody comes to work for you at 25 and they're a fantastic political reporter with great instincts and they've become enormously well networked and they report 100 million great stories for you over time, it may attract the attention of the New York Times. And you can't be bitter about it. Yeah.
Well,
my watch said, I'm not sure I understand that. That's what Siri said. Yeah, that's two of us, actually. I mean, look, the reality is that happens. And you just have to accept it.
Yeah.
But it's okay, because you know what? This is a whole of ecosystem solution to the problems of democracy.
I like that. And there's
Mission Local and the New York Times
Yep.
are both solving the problem. And if it gets solved through your door or their door, it's all good. And
Right.
you have to take that position.
right, because all of us have to make choices. There was a discussion if papers are folding. Are you going to cover local sports? Are you going to, do comics? Are you going to do obituaries? I mean, everyone has to.
Yeah,
make sure
I have a point of view about that I know that others don't necessarily share. I think there's a divide in our business about this. I do not think that public service journalism is covering the St. Louis Cardinals. Where is my friend Bill? I do not believe that covering the High Museum of Art's latest exhibition in Atlanta is public service journalism. Nobody will out-culture me. Nobody will out-sports fan me. But you know what? There are news organizations doing that. Hit them where they ain't. Mm-hmm. Live in the white space. What we're solving for is the stuff not being done. If you create a news organization for the purpose of replicating the fall-down newspaper in your city writ small, I'm not sure you're advancing the cause here. And so I have tended to believe from the very beginning public service journalism is defined with reasonably rigid borders. I mean, a little bit of elasticity, but reasonably rigid borders. I do not believe covering... Look, I mean, I love the University of Texas basketball team. By the way, we're a basketball school now. I don't know if you can tell. And I love that basketball team, especially this year. Mm-hmm. There is no reason for the Texas Tribune to cover the University of Texas basketball team except to ask the question, if you fire another coach and you have to buy out his contract, are you taking money away from academics at an institution that is desperate for higher ed funding? The answer in the case of Texas is no. There's a private foundation that funds athletics, and so there's no commingling of those funds with academics. My point is that it's a higher ed story, it's not a sports story. You don't cover X's and O's. I think that's the right approach for these broadly defined. Now, I've just said they're not all the same,
right.
And not surprisingly, they don't all view their missions the way that I just described it. That's how we approach it.
So it's good news, right, that there are people stepping in, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say public media is stepping in. If you
PBS and NPR stations were there before we were. I mean, it's
Right.
hilarious for us to think we just showed up and you guys didn't exist. We built our models on your backs. We owe you a debt.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And now you're saying we should throw out half our funding.
I am.
I want to talk about, so if you have very different models filling the void, right? That's
Right.
a lot of hope. I think the question is then, and somebody asked this earlier, I think one of the students,
Yeah.
how do you then get people to go and consume that journalism? Because there's so much mistrust. There is a
Right.
vilification of the media. There's a role that the media is playing. In fact, there was I think a Pew study last year where journalists talked about they would be journalists, they believe in journalism, but they don't even think their own organizations are doing a good job clarifying misinformation. So how do we change that?
Well, so let me answer that question in several parts. First of all, the idea that journalism is any more perfect than anything else is absurd. And we in journalism have been among the worst at acknowledging our own fallibility. Let's say for the record, journalism is imperfect. We're too arrogant. We're not humble enough when we make mistakes. We don't walk in other people's shoes very well. We don't hold ourselves to the same high standards that we hold the people we cover, on and on and on. We wonder why people don't trust us. Most of the time, we don't even bother to ask. And we frame a lot of the work that we produce in headlines and on social media in ways that give our critics ammunition when they say we have an agenda. Like, I think there's a lot that we have to answer for, honestly. I still think, warts and all, journalism is the thing we need. It's not all heroes wear capes, right? Like, I do think journalism is the thing we need right now more than ever, even with its shortcomings. But I will also say, as we consider the world in which we live, I think there's an obligation for us to sort through some of the things that you said. Yeah. We live in a world in which people in power have successfully undermined faith and confidence in all kinds of institutions over the last 10 years. Congress, the courts, election administration, libraries. We've undermined faith and trust in libraries, right? This is a big conundrum. It's a big conundrum. And I think we have to try to remind people of the good that we do, but we remind them not by telling them, by showing them. We use the tools of journalism, which is don't tell, show. We have to show them with the quality, fairness, imagination, innovation of our work, and our commitment to our mission above all else. And I think regaining the public's trust in journalism is going to happen. I'm pessimistic about a lot. I'm not pessimistic about that. This is not a forever problem. I'm a big believer in the United States of overcorrection as the answer to a lot of problems. We're all the way over here, we go all the way back over here, and then we come all the way back over here. And I think that what's happened is we've allowed for people to see the worst of us, not only of journalism, but of the democracy that we're living in. And I think that we're going to see a reassertion of something that's more recognizable to us, and I think that we're going to set back somewhere in the middle. And I think that if we do our jobs, this is the important part. We can't be distracted from the job that we do. When President Trump was elected and started attacking the Washington Post, Marty Barron, who was then the editor of the Washington Post, famously said to his staff, "Our job is not to go to war, our job is to go to work." He understood that you don't get distracted by the clown show, that you do your jobs. There's no problem in this country that cannot be solved by more and better journalism. And so I think that's how we stay on the right side of this, and we don't allow people to distract us from the task at hand.
Well, I think you can see why the Texas Tribune was incredibly successful and why it's great to have you here.
It was all of them.
I do want to open up to Q&A. If there are any students who have questions. Are there any students who have questions first? Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Mackenzie McCoy. I'm an assistant editor and staff writer with the Piedmont Virginia Community College newspaper, The Forum. I just want to ask you, it's been wonderful to listen to you talk.
Thank you.
It's interesting to hear, because you say, we're not going to go and cover just this basketball game.
Right.
As a local journalist, it's
Right.
actually exactly what I'm going to go do. But but that's because we're working at two different levels. We're reaching two different groups of
100%.
people. But what I wanted to ask you was, how do you suggest moving forward how local journalists merge not necessarily content but effort with state level journalists like yourself to rebuild an industry that has seen such demise in the
Well, look, I
recent
think there's a lot
years?
of different ways to go at this, and I think that the hyper-local news organizations in this country and our states and our state and this state have a job to do, and they're doing it well, and they're gaining momentum behind. These are deliberately not the same.
Yeah, define local news. I think
Yeah, I
that's
mean, I
helpful,
think
yeah.
that's the thing is
Yeah.
I think state coverage of state legislatures is one version of local. I think what you're talking about, what Angela Shaw was here earlier from Seville Tomorrow, and Luann and Cardinal News, that's another version of, like, people do local. I mean, a lot of people approach this through their own door. They're not all the same. We have more, the Tribune and Cardinal News have more in common than with the city, county level reporting, but it's all a version of local. I think it begins with audience. I think you understand who you're serving and what they lack, what they need, what they say they want, maybe what they don't yet know they want or need. And you work backwards from that. This is not a vanity press. You don't get to just publish the thing that you want. You have to be doing it with full knowledge of what the audience will respond to and what the needs of the community are. And in your case, in fact, the reality is that covering a basketball game may very well be what your readers say they want. We've just taken a different approach. And I think we have to respect the differences between organizations in this space. It's a whole of ecosystem approach. It's all of us together. We're all brothers and sisters in arms. And I don't expect everyone to do what we did. I frankly don't think that what we did would be successful maybe any place else the way we did it. I would fight anybody for the title of I know Texas better than you at this point. I'd win every time. I do not know Virginia. I could not compete for knowledge of Virginia with Luann or anybody else. And so we did not take the franchising the restaurant approach to the Tribune at the beginning intentionally. Because I don't know other places. We did not know other places. What we did might not work other places. Elements of it might work, but different elements in different places. And so you do you.
Yep.
That's it.
All right, right here in front. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Ben Peters with the Rappahannock News, Rappahannock County, Virginia.
Excellent.
You said it really fascinated me that you guys were able to court donors across bipartisan lines.
Correct.
I mean, how did you get them to buy in, especially those on the right who are
Right.
totally opposed to the mission of news?
So this is back, and I'm going to tell you a story from the beginnings of this whole approach to reaching across different, party lines to get support. We had a sense in early 2010 that there might be an opportunity for us to move away from simply raising money from generic rich people or from people who had supported other nonprofits, and since we were a nonprofit, they might support us also. Like the lazy way at this for us was to go, well, let's just pull the ballet's donor list. People supported the ballet, that's a C3, we're a C3. We'll just write those people a letter and go, support us. We brought in, as on a consulting basis, a small retainer for 3 months. This is how long ago it was, 2010. Barack Obama's and John McCain's fundraising leads in Texas. We said, we're going to retain you for 3 months on a small retainer, and we want you to come in and talk to us about how you raised money for politics. And the premise here turned out to be right. You have two people in the world, Melody and Evan. Evan writes a $1,000 check to the ballet. Melody writes a $1,000 check to Barack Obama or John McCain or Rick Perry, who was governor of Texas at the time. Which is more likely to support a nonprofit news organization? Melody. The motivation to give to politics aligned more closely with the motivation to give to, the premise said, one of these. But we didn't have any experience at all in prospecting off of political donor lists. We didn't know how to look at those lists and determine who might be a potential candidate for giving to one of these. And so we brought in Democratic and Republican version of this person and said, talk to us about this. The woman on the Republican side who raised money for John McCain in Texas happened to be the wife of Rick Perry's chief of staff. And she was also the fundraising lead for the Republican Governors Association. So she had quite a bit of transparency into this world. And she said to me, when you and this again, very sort of elemental, overly broad statement, but just go with me for a minute. She said, when you talk to Democrats, talk about journalism. When you talk to Republicans, talk about Texas. Because if you talk about journalism to Republicans, they're going to think liberal. And I went, Really, it was an early version of talk about democracy. because there are going to be people who hear democracy and hear liberal also. But generally speaking, don't make it about journalism. Make it about civic purpose. Maybe I'll say it that way. This thing that we can all agree, if we agree on nothing else, we all agree that we want Texas to be the best place that it possibly can be, however we define best. We want to have the best quality of life, we want to have the best business climate, we want to take care of everybody in the state, all that. Don't talk about journalism, talk about Texas. Okay. So we pulled donor lists. And we have, of course, the federal donor lists for federal candidates, and then we have something called the Texas Ethics Commission, where candidates for state office have got to file quarterly. We pulled those lists. And we looked at patterns of people who gave, and to particular kinds of candidates. And we said to ourselves, well, if this donor is giving to these candidates and giving this much in the aggregate, what do we have to lose? Let's give them a shot. And so I started effectively cold calling a bunch of people who had been political donors. And, limited success at the beginning, but no success. And over time, it grew. My favorite story in this period was in 2013. After President Obama was reelected, beat Mitt Romney. Late in that, in early 2013, I pulled the first filing of 2013 was, I think, the last period of the 2012 campaign. I think this is right. And a guy in Fort Worth who I had never heard of, who turned out to be a guy who made all his money with a hedge fund and then retired at like 40, gave, I think, somehow through associated committees and this, basically a total of $1 million to the Romney campaign, after he should have known better. Like, it was late enough in the campaign, it's like, dude. So I wrote him a letter where I said, you don't know me, but I run the Texas Tribune. It's a news organization in Austin, and we do these things. And I said, I noticed that you gave about $1 million to Governor Romney pretty late in the campaign when it was kind of clear how this was going to turn out. I said, if you're going to flush $1 million down the toilet, flush it down mine. So he thought that was funny. Like, I literally did that. He thought it was funny. And so we got on the phone, started talking. I went up to Fort Worth. He's been a $100,000 donor to the Tribune every year since. Like, literally, every year since. Like, I think in some ways, connecting with people at a human level, acknowledging their interest in this stuff, people who give to politics, look, they know they're not going to win every time. They know. But they believe. They want the world to be better. They care about issues. They care about politics. I mean, if you go after people whose whole interest is predicated on the thing that you cover is the thing that they care enough about to part with their money already, that's a pretty good place to begin the conversation. And so over time, sometimes it's a marathon and not a sprint. Ross Perot Jr. would be an example of another wealthy Texan, huge Republican donor, one of the largest Republican donors in Texas. I couldn't get his attention for 5 years. 5 years. I'd write to him, nothing. Finally, through a mutual connection, I was able to make my case to him, but from some distance. He said he would think about it. And then I was standing in line at the supermarket at the end of whatever the first year was, and for the 13 years I was running the Tribune, every time we got a gift, I'd get a little ping on my phone through authorized.net. It would tell me this person gave a gift and this is how much. And so I'm online at the supermarket paying. It's the end of whatever that calendar year was, and I see Ross Perot Jr. made a gift, and I'm like, oh my God, Christmas has come early. This is so great. And I look, and it's $1,000. And I was like, what? Where are all the other zeros? Hold on. Doesn't he know that I know how much he's worth? He was trying before he bought.
Yeah, you got to prospect. You got to create
Right?
those relationships.
Had to prove it. He said, okay, I'm going to dip my toe in the water. Well, he's since then become a 7-figure donor to the Tribune. Tried before he bought. It takes a while sometimes with some of these folks. Sometimes you get them immediately. Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes you never get them. You know who I pursued for years and years, never got, had great meetings with him, but he turned me down every time? Harlan Crow. Right? I did.
All right, let's take one more question.
All right.
Let me come over here. Yeah, in the back, the students here. Yep.
Me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you talked about how, sorry, gotta get my notes. So you talked about how you don't print for the Tribune.
We don't. I'm sorry, we don't.
You don't print.
Print, correct.
Everything's online, and I
Yes.
think that is incredibly interesting. So I was just wondering what the cons of that are, because I can kind of.
I'll let you know when I come up with one. To me, untethering yourself from legacy costs is a way to redirect money you would otherwise have to spend on those legacy expenses back into journalism. At the end of the day, the people who support the Texas Tribune, somebody asked me, more than one person asked me, do you have before I came up, do you have an endowment? Look, when people give me money, they are giving me money because they want us to do journalism. Anything that I use that money for that is not journalism is not what they intend for me to spend that money on. Now, you could argue printing the paper is journalism adjacent, or it's just journalism. But I want to spend money on reporting. Spending money on reporting means spending money on reporters and other people who produce journalism. So to me, it's a very clear value. I don't see a downside. I mean, we could distribute copies in print to people who don't want to consume content online. Like, I get it, intellectually I get it. But to me, this is the right way to go. And I've got Zoomer children who I swear to God literally have never held a print newspaper in their hands. Like, this is the future. This is the present. And I think it's critical for us to understand that it's not about us, it's about them, whoever them is. Like, one of the things I didn't say about journalism and its many failings today is that we all talk about ourselves so much, too much, but we don't talk nearly as much as we ought to about our audience and about our impact. I am always focused on the audience of this stuff, as I know you are.
Yeah.
I'm always focused on the end user. Who is the beneficiary of this work that we're spending so much time and so much money to produce? And if I think about them, I know what they don't want. They don't want us to do things the way they've always been done, because that didn't work. And I just think, no. The only way forward is forward. And for us, that means untethering ourselves from as many of those legacy expenses as we possibly can. Are we really out of time?
Yeah, I know. We could
are?
spend hours with Evan. First, I want to thank you for coming to
bummed.
Richmond
Okay,
and
well, sure.
joining us. I think everyone would agree. Tremendous conversation, and I can't think of a better cap to this, especially as
Right.
everyone's about to go get a cocktail. I do want to thank Matthew and Melody, the Virginia
Yes.
Humanities and the Karsh Institute. The panel yesterday talked about the intersection, obviously, between democracy and journalism and informed citizens. So
Yeah.
this could not be a more important discussion, and I'm glad you said this is the first of many. And again, I think this is the best way. And you'll have to come back then, because I feel like we only scratched the surface.
I'm thrilled to, and I'm happy to talk to people afterwards as we're kind of milling about. So,
Great.
Jamie,
well, thank you,
Jamie,
everybody.
you did a great job. Thank you very much.